Senate Democrats approved a $3.5 trillion budget resolution early this morning. Joining us now to discuss is former National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, host of the Bad Faith podcast, and contributing editor at Current Affairs, Briahna Joy Gray. Briahna, I want to read out for you a number of the things that are in this $3.5 trillion resolution. The details have to be written over the next weeks and months, so a lot remains to be decided. But let me lay out the broad outlines, and then you just pick up whichever ones you want to talk about in either direction. So it expands Medicare. That's the Bernie Sanders piece to include, dental, vision, and hearing. It lowers drug prices by allowing Medicare to negotiate over those prices with drug companies directly. It includes Obamacare subsidies. That would mean that nobody would pay more than 8.5% of their income on health insurance, and lower income, middle income people wouldn't pay anything for premiums. It includes subsidies for child care so that nobody would pay more than 7% of their income for child care. It includes, $200 billion for clean energy, $135 billion for forest and agriculture and climate programs around farming. It expands the child tax credit into 2025. It includes elements of the PRO Act. It's not clear what elements of the PRO Act are going to be in it. And it includes immigration reform, a pathway to citizenship for about 10 million people. There's more in it than that, but which of those do you think are the most important, and what do you think is the most important thing that's being left out?
It certainly is good news that the Democratic Party and the government has decided to do what it should have been doing for the last 40 years. So credit where credit is due. The question now here is how much progressives are going to be able to keep focus on all that still needs to be done, given the fact that we are in an unprecedented crisis, the likes of which we haven't seen in nearly double that time. So, for example, it's obviously incredible. This was a huge part of the Bernie campaign that we wanted not just Medicare for all, but for Medicare to include dental, hearing, and vision. It also remains crucial that more people get access to that who are younger and younger, so that yes, eventually everybody in America can have access to those kinds of programs. It's incredibly important not to lose sight of all of the things that Joe Biden can do by virtue of executive order, including canceling student debt. And this is a conversation that we recently had with former Bernie deputy campaign manager Ari Rabenhoft in this two-part episode that we had come out this week, where there's a very different set of concerns and concentration for activists and people who are playing an outside game than insiders. And in moments like this where there is some progress, it can be difficult for progressives to continue to push for the things that are very much needed against the overwhelming media tide of you should be happy with this progress. And of course, progress is good, and Bernie Sanders has been fighting a very valiant fight for a very long time to get these things achieved. And I think it's appropriate to have a moment of victory while also being kind of clear-eyed about the path before us.
Briahna, what do you think is most likely to be cut by people like Kristen Sinema or Joe Manchin? What do you think they're going to want to throw out?
Well, you already see Joe Manchin making a bunch of noise about how our children and grandchildren can't fit the bill for, in particular, some of these climate policies, never mind whether or not his children and grandchildren are going to be walking on hot lava and whether they have a habitable planet, right? So it's important to keep in mind that this is a budget agreement. This isn't actual legislation that won't be coming down the pike for quite some time. And there's a lot of room for people to fight over many, many parts of this. You've seen progressives in the House say that they will block the bipartisan bill if the integrity of this Democrat bill isn't maintained. And I think that will be a really interesting tee-off over some of these issues that I would argue are existential in nature and should be of paramount importance to everyone living on the earth, versus some of these political considerations, which in this particular context are obscured by the fact that this isn't final legislation.
So, Briahna, I usually hate these questions, but I genuinely want to know your opinion on it. How would you rate the Biden White House's handling of progressive policies? How do progressives view how he's doing so far?
Well, I keep reading that he's a real boon for progressives, and now we have absolutely nothing left to complain about. I checked my notes, and that doesn't seem to be quite what's borne out. I think the reality is that in a country where there's a Democrat in the White House, we have we also have a Congress. It's pretty unconscionable that, but for Cori Bush sleeping out on the steps of Congress, we might have had an expired eviction moratorium and millions of Americans out in the street in a way that was completely foreseeable and preventable. I think that it's really very disappointing that some of the really core campaign promises that people remember, right? People remember what they were promised last summer as the George Floyd protests were raging, as they looked down the barrel of a year of being on lockdown. People lost their jobs. 15 million people lost their health insurance. People recall being promised a $2,000 check. That Kamala Harris advocated for recurring checks, and that all of those kinds of promises, including student debt cancellation, have gone on the back burner. And I don't think, especially for a younger population who doesn't have kids, may never have kids because of the economic strait that our generation is in, are going to be so easily appeased by the kinds of programs that ultimately still accrue disproportionately to a more stable, affluent part of the country, the kind of the homeowner, the family person. I think it's incredibly important that those kinds of benefits are extended, but there is still a very frustrated, particularly disenfranchised, marginalized group that skews younger, that you're not going to get to start engaging in the political process and might start sitting out in even greater numbers if those kinds of concerns aren't addressed. So my grade, I'm not an easy grader in this category.
And Briahna, I wanted to ask you, I wanted to pick up on your comments about Manchin and House progressives, because Manchin has a pretty observable pattern, and it played out this morning. So he voted for the $3.5 trillion plan, and then he puts out this statement attacking Democrats, attacking spending, saying that he's really not comfortable. He was fine to vote for it, but he's not comfortable really moving forward, and we all got to worry about the deficit. His pattern is that he creates as many news cycles as he possibly can where he is in conflict with Democrats in Washington, and then almost all the time at the very end, he votes with those very same Democrats. It's sort of like this game that he's playing back in West Virginia, where he says, I really didn't want to do it, but I ended up doing it in the end. But he very much wants this $550 billion bipartisan infrastructure plan that he and Kyrsten Sinema negotiated with Republicans. He wants that to pass into law. And so House progressives do have real leverage here, because there's a lot of good stuff in that plan. But on the other hand, if they don't get the climate money and the other things in this $3.5 trillion plan, you could make an argument that it's just absolutely not worth passing that $550 billion plan, and they should stick it to Manchin and just kill it and drag its corpse through the street. And if Manchin doesn't want to play ball here, then fine, tank him in the House. Do you think that House progressives have the spine to do that?
We shall see. Look, I am always hopeful. I think progressives on the outside absolutely have to work diligently to keep their feet to the fire and remind Americans of the commitment that they've made to do exactly that. But of course, the track record so far this year hasn't been good. We started out the year, January 3rd, with this vote for Nancy Pelosi, with which many progressives were advocating that they not confirm Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House until and unless she gave certain concessions, whether it be eliminating pay-go, getting rid of Richie Neal as head of the Ways and Means Committee, bringing Medicare for All to a floor vote, securing committee positions that didn't actually materialize. That didn't happen. Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the House, and in fact, progressive lost out on a lot of committee appointment opportunities that they were hoping to secure. And in the wake of that, there was conversation about how, well, we're going to save our political capital for the fight over $15 minimum wage. Joe Biden and corporate Democrats effectively neutered the $15 minimum wage with nary a peep from the mainstream media, who didn't seem to be following any of the machinations around the parliamentarian and how bad faith they were. And now here we are at this juncture. And I am hopeful that at very least, if there was any political capital to be saved up, And I want to be really clear that I am skeptical of that understanding of how political capital works. But if they have some big old reserve that they've been sitting on, now would be the time to deploy it. And whether or not they have the mettle to do so, we'll see. I remember speaking to voters when I was in Cleveland following Senator Turner's race, and one woman in particular was very hostile to the idea of voting for Senator Turner, in particular because she thought she would act like squad members who would, fight with Democrats and be, obstruct Democratic agenda. And there is obviously some degree of backlash that will occur from folks who just want people to be team players and go along to get along. And it is going to be incumbent on them to do what Joe Manchin is doing, which is to use the media to generate cycles that reveal the enormous gap between what the people want and what the Democratic Party is willing to fight for, so they can start to see squad members as the people who are really fighting for them, as they did in the case of the Cori Bush stunt on the Capitol steps, rather than people who are obstructing the good corporate Democrats who somehow have maintained their position for most Americans as being the good guys in their mind.
Yeah, there does seem to be a disconnect there between what people want, initiatives that people want, versus what the Democratic establishment is actually going to do. And, speaking of that, David Serrata actually pointed this out, that even though the polls show voters support good initiatives, then those voters continue to elect politicians who killed those same initiatives. So why do you think there is such a disconnect between the initiatives people want, those progressive politicians like Nina Turner, who would push those progressive policies forward, and then the voting base who then turns around and says, oh, wait, but, she's going to fight too much with the Democratic establishment, and then what? I mean, is the answer there that these people then think that the Democratic establishment is going to be supportive of these initiatives that they clearly are not? Where do you think that disconnect is?
David Serrata is singing my song for sure. Look, the fundamental problem is, how are Americans ever supposed to understand that the corporate big D Democrats aren't fighting for them if no one in the media ever covers it? How are they supposed to understand that all of the conversation around the parliamentarian being the excuse for why we couldn't have a $15 minimum wage is bunk if that is not a central piece of the conversation that is happening on TV? If none of the politicians who go on to defend the Biden administration are never asked pointedly by any of these corporate news hosts at MSNBC or CNN why it is that they didn't just overrule the parliamentarian as George Bush did for his tax cuts. How are Americans ever supposed to understand that when Senator Turner says voting for Joe Biden is like having to, eat half a bowl of caca, that there's reasons, that voters shouldn't think, oh, she's in the line of the Democratic Party, but in fact that she's pointing out the reality that Joe Biden was the author of the crime bill, that Joe Biden is the reason why substantially student loan debt is one of the only kinds of debt you can't discharge in bankruptcy, that he spent his entire career palling around with segregationists and opposing busing and being on the wrong side of every issue and NAFTA and on and on and on down the line. You can't at some level blame voters for having that misapprehension if there's so little education going on about what American political history has been. And you can't rely on corporate media to do it. You can't rely on corporate politicians to do it. And what you're left with is relying on alternative media sources, left media sources, and frankly, right-wing media sources to try to excavate that history. And that's work that has to be done between election cycles and not just put on a candidate like Senator Turner in the 11th hour to go and do an entire voter re-education so that they can understand what the stakes are and who really is and isn't fighting for them.
Well, Briahna Joy Gray, I haven't listened to your latest episode with Ari Ravenhoff, but I heard from him that it's a really fascinating conversation. I heard it went 3 or 4 hours. And so
it did. That's why we split into a two-parter.
Yeah, I very much bet it's worth it. I would suggest everybody check it out. I'm going to when this program's over. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all.
And we'll have more Rising for you right after this.